So, welcome back and to part 6 of Beyond the Limen. Today, we're going to be expanding our knowledge even more, covering some vital philosophical ground behind this practice of active imagination. And notably, we're going to be talking about the ethical dimension that we must bring to this practice. It's very important. And actually, it's the same ethical dimension that we do well to bring to our daily life. And if we're not doing it there, then we're not doing it anywhere, arguably. But there's some pretty key philosophical reasons for this, which we'll get into in today's session. And it has to do also with the nature of the mind and the unconscious mind. Some have described it as like the archetypes have an amoral component. Now, there's some kind of truth in that, but I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that the unconscious is amoral, so much as the various parts of the objective psyche, i.e. the archetypes. So we're talking about the anima, the animus, the mother, the father, the self, the shadow to an extent. They each have their own motivations, goals. They have a certain reason for existing. And it's part of our job as a human to work with those, to neither reject and deny them, nor to allow them to overpower us and inflate us. So there's a related concept here around ego inflation, which is really where the energy of a primordial image, i.e. an archetype, has overtaken an ego. Now, it is true that no one person or no single ego can fully integrate an archetype, and we discussed this earlier. But it can, of course, and you can cultivate a relationship to that archetype. That's one thing to say, is very important. The other thing is that it's also the job of the ego to hold things down, set limitations. This is in some sense what the ego does. It is a kind of limitation on experience, not in a negative sense, but in the sense that there has to be this limit so that these various forces can combine, interact, and we can discover through that what unifies them, ultimately, what the truth is behind it. Hence, this is all about self-knowledge. You know, what's really at the heart of it all. It's not that the masculine is good and the feminine is bad, or vice versa, but that they each contain vital, they are the foundation of reality. So those examples are even more overarching. But it also applies to any inclination or thought or thesis. There's always some value in it. There's always some truth in it. And actually, as humans, we tend to kind of conflate those two things. In other words, if there is value in anything, in an ideology, God forbid, or any political movement or any theory or any paradigm, whether it be materialism or idealism, they all have value and they all may help us navigate at a certain point in our lives, and we may come to believe that they are therefore the truth. Well, more accurately, they contain some truth, but they're not the absolute truth. So this idea of inflation, when an archetype just completely comes in and overrides the ego, and suddenly it thinks, it's the world savior, or it has to be this perfect, absolutely flawless mother, or, hey, maybe the shadow takes over. Maybe this happens on a temporary basis where we end up doing things that actually, in our better state of mind, we wouldn't do because we'd know that it is destructive or counterproductive. So let's look at what some of the thinkers on this topic have said. Robert Johnson, in his book Inner Work, said, firstly, it is our job as conscious human beings to introduce the ethical elements into the proceedings. So again, this is practically mostly true most of the time. It's not that the archetypes they're completely amoral in that sense. It's more that there's a kind of automaticity to them. And not to mention that, but a great deal of energy and power. So the ego has to set limitations there, and has to question whether that energy in its symbolic form, in its isolated form, is on its own serving self-knowledge on one hand, but also is it moving towards something wholesome? And like I say, an element of it is, yes. But when taken to an extreme, let's just say, for example, if we took this Sagittarian energy to an extreme, then we're going to be always looking to expand and travel and philosophize, but never actually taking the opposite view and just kind of settling down, being where we are, going inward, focusing on our feelings as an example. So no single energy or archetype on its own is the answer to everything. And so there's a blend of all of these things that must meet in the central point, which as humans, that's what we call our ego. So it is within that where we, as the human, has to actually introduce limitation. So Johnson goes on, it is the conscious ego, guided by a sense of ethics, that must set limits in order to protect the imaginative process from becoming inhuman or destructive or going off into extremes. So what might that mean? I mean, to become inhuman, right? So clearly anything taken to excess is not conducive to wholeness. But there's also the element of free will here. And this is something I've really tried to tease apart in my courses. So the Make It Conscious Philosophy course and in other places as well, where it's not merely about the sheer quantity of energy. There's also the free will that's involved. And that's something we have as human beings. We have to honor that. We have to acknowledge that about ourselves. And in a curious twist, acknowledging that actually allows us to do more with it. That's one thing that was discussed in the previous part here. So it's not only about going into extremes, but it's also about using those energies for immoral things. Now, Johnson doesn't go much further in terms of describing what ethics would actually mean because, well, it's a huge subject. It wasn't really the point of his book. And neither is going to be in our huge discussion here. But just very briefly, because clearly we all have different preferences. And if I have this addiction to chocolate cake and someone prevents me from accessing chocolate cake on a particular day, are they unethical to do that? And is my displeasure at that fact a surefire sign of that other person's unethical, immoral behavior? Probably not. Like, it cannot be entirely subjective. But can it be entirely objective? Well, there's people who think that yes, it is, and that morality is an absolute thing, and that even though the answers may not be there in practice, they do exist in principle. Well, like with all these things, it's a dialectic, so there's probably some truth to both. There has to be some subjective element, because if you imagine if it was just purely utilitarian, so, utilitarianism is a stance that basically says the greatest good for the greatest number. Let's say we had to make the person at the bottom of society bear the burden of all the suffering, and everyone else kind of got to live an okay existence, but there was one person who just had to bear it all. Is that the kind of existence that any of us would really want to live in? Not only that, what would that actually say about the rest of us if we were living in that way and going about our lives as though it wasn't really a problem? Like, it's serving the greatest number, and yeah, I happen to be one of those numbers. So there's something clearly a bit warped about the purely objective side to that as well. So clearly it cannot be purely utilitarian, but neither can it be entirely subjective. So there is a dialectic going on here. There is some truth to both. So I think this comes down to, again, this idea of freedom. Honoring our own freedom is necessary, but also honoring other people's freedom and other beings' freedom. So if we're using our freedom to violate freedom, in Schelling's thought, this was actually the very definition of evil. So when we go into active imagination, we're allowing these forces to meet. We consciously want something, but other parts of us, whether they're from the personal unconscious or collective elements, archetypes, they want something else. Where can those lines meet? What can we make of that? And we do this enough, we realize that actually our conscious stance, certainly until we start taking inner work a bit more seriously, can be so far off, it's scary, to realize how far off the conscious stance was and how convincing nonetheless it seemed at the time. So again, there's a meta lesson, right? There's this lesson about the lesson, the nature of the lessons themselves here. And this is what Ken James is referring to here, in part, about deepening a relationship with the unconscious itself. And therefore, putting the ego where it should be. It has this exalted role in a sense because it's bringing this ethical element. But at the same time, it's also a humble role because it recognizes that it's just this cork floating around an ocean of psychic material, and that the ego comes from it. The ego doesn't create the place it came from, the material it came from. It's actually the other way around. So this is our role here. Moving on to Carl Jung. So a slightly different point here, but still very much relevant to the topic of ethics. And Carl Jung said that we know that the mask of the unconscious is not rigid. It reflects the face we turn towards it. Hostility lends it a threatening aspect. Friendliness softens its features. I'm actually going to jump straight to the next quote by Michael Tsarion on a similar theme here. He said on the Unslaved podcast that the face that examines and looks into the psyche determines how the psyche reveals itself. And then he said, it morphs in response to your own motives of looking into it. That's a moral statement. If I have immoral reasons for looking into the sacred realm of the unconscious, I'll be met with demons. That's what pathology is in the Jungian sense. So the key takeaway from both of these is to cultivate wholesome intentions when, well, at all times, but not least during active imagination. All the ways you might engage with someone in your daily life, being honest, being empathic, doesn't mean being ultra hyper friendly in order to sort of try and appear a certain way. It's not about reverse engineering a perception. It's about that empathy, which I define as a willingness to transform. Doesn't mean you have to put this mask on. If anything, it's about letting the mask go. It's about no longer needing to be seen a certain way. And the unconscious will actually respond to that. So if you do encounter something challenging, make no mistake, it doesn't mean that it's because you have immoral reasons for going there. Although the shadow may well reflect some aspect of ourselves that does have immoral reasons. But you see, there's another layer to this. There's another layer to morality. And this is that element of free will that I mentioned earlier. Because it's one thing to encounter something scary in your own mind and do something about it and integrate with it. And it's a whole other thing to encounter it and go, oh, got to get out of there, move away from that. That wasn't very fun. I'm going to go off and just carry on my day. And it's not about whether or not you're strong enough or capable of doing that. It's about the fundamental choice you make. It's about the direction. Are you using the conscious mind to genuinely move towards greater consciousness of yourself, to integrate the various aspects of the psyche? This is what I would describe as wholesome, right? As opposed to unwholesome, which is exalting the self-image above all else, using freedom to violate freedom, and therefore doing evil by Schelling's definition. And we have the free will to do that, of course. That was discussed in the previous part here. So just because you're encountering dark things, and if you do shadow exercises, you are likely to, and they may not necessarily be malevolent entities, but they may well nonetheless be uncomfortable, different thing there. But encountering malevolence is something that has to happen both in our inner work and in the world around us. And this is part of what I would call outer shadow work. It's come to terms with that which is difficult to confront in the world itself. Two sides of the same coin here, inner work and outer work. You can't really separate them. So there's a fundamental difference between choosing to work with that, confront it, move towards integration, or moving towards separation and maybe trying to employ sorcery here, use these skills, these tools for selfish ends, that all you're doing there is actually bolstering the ego in such a way that you don't have to go near unresolved feeling. All right, that's kind of the primary motivation for narcissism, psychopathy, sociopathy. It's this repressed, unresolved feeling that on some level one has kind of made a decision to never go near. So that kind of explains that. But at the heart of that is free will, because everyone has difficult experiences. Not everyone uses those as an excuse to exert power over other people. So ultimately, are you employing empathy in these interactions, or are you serving power? That's the key difference here. Whether you're serving love or you're serving power, by itself will not change the fact that you still have to encounter demons at some point in your mind and in the world. So, last quote here before we move on to the exercise. So this one is by John Finley, and it's from the foreword to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. The subject or ego is thus for Hegel not what we ordinarily understand by a personal thinker, but the logical function of universality in a particular sort of detachment from its species and instances. The mind for Hegel, as for Aristotle, is thus the place of forms, a bustling agora where such forms are involved in endless transactions and conversations. And though it is by the intermediation of such forms that there is a reaching out to their individual instances, they nonetheless enjoy a relative independence there, a detachment in the thought ether that they never enjoy elsewhere. So this is, believe it or not, a simplified, brief explanation of an aspect of Hegel's phenomenology, but it does capture, in a curiously kind of Jungian way, what is going on here in our minds. The mind, the ego, is like this bustling agora, this meeting place or marketplace, where all these different energies can come and blend and converse and transact. And it's through this intermediation that they can understand themselves and that we can understand the self. So in today's exercise, we're going to be using this as a bit of inspiration. We're going to be using this place as the seed, actually. So I'm going to be guiding you up until a point, but at some point I'm going to be leaving it to you and letting you decide in which way this exercise needs to go. So with that said, I invite you just to make sure you're comfortable. And just settling the mind down. In the usual way, it's really just about stopping here. It can help to ease into meditation gradually. Just notice what's going on in your mind right now. Does it feel like a bustling agora with lots of disparate thoughts and inclinations? Or is it relatively calm? Would you say you feel relatively content right now? Or are you in a more painful state of mind? So when you're ready then, just bring the attention to the breath. Apply a little more effort. Just getting a general sense of the breath. And then seeing if you can fix your attention on a single point of the breath. And if at any point during the exercise your mind wanders, No problem. Simply bring the attention back to the exercise. Now, opening up to the imagination. And visualize yourself standing in the middle of a great, bustling agora. And just take a look around you at all the activity. Various people, creatures, objects. All involved in various activities, transactions, and conversations. Take your time just to explore and examine this place. Taking note of all the various scenes and entities around you. What kind of entities and objects do you see? What kinds of activities are they engaged in? Every aspect of this place represents something in the psyche. It all has some energetic corollary in the mind. Is there anyone here who seems to be in conflict or suffering in some way? Imagine now you come across a person in a state of suffering or conflict. You're now going to call on what you've learned so far in this series. Bring on board an ethical dimension. Try to find out what the problem is with this figure. What is it they want? Why is it they don't have it? And what problems would it cause if they had their way entirely? Take the next minute or so to engage in a free-form interaction with this figure. See if you can aim towards a reconciliation where both of you are able to come away with a result you're satisfied with. If you can't seem to achieve a full synthesis at this time, see if you can just achieve at least a trade-off, knowing that inner work often takes time, persistence, and that you can always come back to this place and continue this interaction. So take this time now to engage in a free-form dialogue with this figure. So, as this conversation draws to a close, before you say farewell to this figure, you're going to exchange a couple of words of advice. Be sure to remain humble. Don't assume that you have the answers for this figure. And likewise, don't assume that it has the full truth or the absolute truth as far as you're concerned. But there will necessarily be at least some symbolic truth in what it has to say. So thank the figure, the interaction. Take one last look around at this place. Notice if anything has changed since your engagement with it. Just allowing the scene to fade now. And gradually bringing the attention back into the space around you. Noticing any physical sensations, sounds, and opening your eyes again in your own time. So a slightly different take on the format there. The only seed really was this idea of a bustling marketplace. But I then introduced a secondary seed of a figure in conflict or a figure in suffering, a suffering state that clearly represents some part of yourself. Relating this to the 5 elements of shadow, this would pertain to that aspect of desires. So in some sense, like every aspect of us has a desire or has a will, and they're not the same thing, but it certainly has a will, and it serves a purpose in moving us and everything around us closer to wholeness with itself, closer to the self. And yet its will, left unchecked, will just take it off purely on its own into what Hegel would have termed for itself. So it comes to exist for the sake of itself and nothing else. And that's where our job as the human being is to come in and reconcile with that and give it its rightful place, but not let it completely off the hook so that it then causes harm to everything else, including you. So the idea there was just to introduce that aspect of you, that desiring aspect, what the downsides of giving it complete free reign would be and complete unlimitation, but at the same time, recognizing the value in what it wants and needs. And so, it'd be interesting to know what you found in your imagination there and what it represented. What aspect of your life or experience did it reflect? Is it some very, very long, unresolved matter? Is it something from more recent times? Maybe that has its roots in something much earlier. It generally is the case. So with that said, I hope that was all very useful. I'm just going to refer briefly to the short guide I wrote called The Way of Individuation, where I talk a little bit more about this ethical component. It's only a 50-page guide. I'll probably update it someday soon, probably at least 6 months away, that job. But it's nonetheless a suitable introduction to the 7 habits of individuation model. And as part of that, habit 2, which is to cultivate wholesome intentions, I go into a little bit about what that actually means, because I have to be very careful about merely good intentions, because what looks like good intentions can be the most diabolical intentions. So it's about passing that apart. And I think generally I'll end on this note, because the topic of today is a philosophical one. And I think that in our culture, and in not least shadow work, we struggle to discern between wholesome and unwholesome. We don't really have a well-formed theory of evil or an understanding of evil. And we often tend to assume that people do bad things just because they had a difficult childhood or something. And meanwhile, those can be important factors. There's a whole other side to this, which is the role of free will. And it's very, very important in individuation and in gaining self-knowledge that we have a properly formed concept for this, and that we can split them apart and tell the difference. So for example, like you often hear talk of defense mechanisms, your ego is just defending and such like. But you see, there's a difference between someone who's defending because they're trying to serve themselves and their self-image versus someone who is simply encountering an aspect of themselves which they necessarily hasn't left behind, but doing so with empathic intentions, and where their pervading willpower is moving towards integration and realizing the authentic self at the heart of that. So you see, it can both be called defense, but actually the difference is intention. And it's a big difference. It's all the difference, actually. It's the very direction one moves in. And the same encounter with one's shadow could have 2 very different meanings in that case. So it's not really accurate to just lump it all in with this idea of defense mechanism, because one is actually kind of defending a pre-existing self-image that's never going to be let go of. And the other one has nothing really to do with defense. It's just the way that person is rendering their experience to them based on their current experience and their current knowledge. So with that, I will thank you for your time and attention, and look forward to seeing you in the last part here. And in the meantime, feel free to leave a comment down below. Always appreciate a like. By the way, the link for that, if you did want to download the guide, is makeitconscious.com/7habits. But for now, thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.